All right, welcome ladies and gentlemen to the second lecture from Chapter 22 in Ralston Valley High School's AP Chemistry lecture series here. In this lecture, we'll be covering organic chemistry, specifically functional groups and isomers. Let's get started. So in our previous lecture on organic chemistry, we went through and started by naming those alkanes as the basis of our structures in organic chemistry. Those alkane molecules, again, were the hydrocarbon, the saturated hydrocarbon chains, and we named those hydrocarbon chains based around the number of carbons present in each of the chain molecules. Now, because organic chemistry is the branch of carbon-based molecules, we can make these molecules a little bit more interesting by adding some flavor to them in the form of what we refer to as functional groups. A functional group are the name we give to additional atoms or groups of atoms that alter the properties and the behaviors of the hydrocarbon. Those functional groups are found in what we refer to as hydrocarbon derivatives. And interestingly here, this is kind of essentially adding different atoms to our hydrocarbon chains that gives these molecules specifically different physical and chemical properties. And now that we've kind of gone through the basics of organic nomenclature in terms of naming those simple hydrocarbon chains, we can now go about figuring out how to name and then think about the properties of some of these derivatives of those hydrocarbon chains by looking at what happens when we add interesting atoms to them. So as an example here, have a look here at the two diagrams which we have diagrammed out for you here on this page. On the left-hand side right there, we've got a 3-carbon saturated hydrocarbon. That is an alkane molecule. And as a 3-carbon alkane, you guys would now recognize this at this point as a molecule of propane. On the right-hand side, I again have a 3-carbon chain, which is looking a whole lot like propane. But note here now that I've got an oxygen present in here as well. And in particular, off of the second carbon there, the central carbon, there's actually, rather than a hydrogen present, there's actually an OH group present right there. And that OH group there is going to change the behaviors of my molecule in terms of its chemical and physical properties. As it turns out, the molecule diagrammed on the right-hand side there is a familiar one. That molecule right there is called isopropyl alcohol, or otherwise known as 2-propanol by its official name. And that 2-propanol is actually, as it turns out, a chemical compound that's probably familiar to many of you. This is another name for isopropyl alcohol, which is essentially just rubbing alcohol. So what we're going to kind of show you here in this next lecture here is how we can recognize some of the common little groups of atoms that tend to get attached to these main branches of our alkane molecules, and how we can name them also based upon which particular little groups we have off to the side, and also how we might be able to predict some of the properties based upon which groups are present. So that's kind of where we're going within this lecture. Let's have a look at our next slide. All right, so with the introduction now taken care of there and seeing one of those functional groups present on the molecules on the previous slide, let's go ahead now and talk a little bit more in depth about the specific functional group which we introduced to you on the last slide. That functional group that we were dealing with there is referred to as a hydroxyl functional group. That is the grouping of an oxygen bonded to a hydrogen. So if we've got kind of a side branch there, which is an OH rather than an alkyl substituent, we refer to that functional group again as a hydroxyl group, and the class of molecule we would then be dealing with is referred to as an alcohol. Now, there are some familiar alcohols that we probably have experience with seeing in our daily lives. The most familiar of those is a molecule called ethyl alcohol, otherwise known as ethanol. Ethyl alcohol is essentially based around a molecule of ethane, ethane being a 2-carbon hydrocarbon chain. But we're going to substitute for one of the hydrogens on the ethane molecule a hydroxyl functional group. That is, we're going to swap out an OH into that molecule. And that changes ethane into ethanol, otherwise known as ethyl alcohol. Generally, when we name an alcohol molecule, that is any molecule where we see that hydroxyl functional group present, we're going to start by taking the name of the alkane, and then we're going to modify the suffix of that alkane's name by adding the suffix OL. So ethane becomes ethanol. Or, for example, on the previous slide, we also showed you there isopropyl alcohol, which goes by the name also of 2-propanol. The 2 there showing that the hydroxyl functional group in isopropyl alcohol, or 2-propanol, comes off of the second carbon. So what I want you to notate here, guys, looking down at the bottom of the slide there, is the alcohol functional group is going to alter the behavior of these molecules. And not only the presence of the functional group itself, but also the position where that functional group is present, kind of the neighborhood of where we find that functional group, is also going to affect the molecular properties and behavior of those molecules. Have a look here at the diagrams of those Lewis dot structures down at the bottom. In these Lewis dot structures, any place where you see here the label R, you can think of that as essentially standing for the rest of the molecule, that is, some other hydrocarbon chain coming off of that particular group. So have a look there on the left-hand side there. We've diagrammed for you what we call a primary alcohol, where the hydroxyl functional group comes off of a carbon which is bonded only to one other carbon. So again, primary refers to a carbon bonded to one other C. That is as opposed to a secondary alcohol, where the hydroxyl functional group is itself bonded to a carbon, which in turn is bonded to 2 other carbons. So you see there that the carbon there is bonded not only to the rest of the molecule R, but also to the other part of the rest of the molecule R prime. So because that carbon there is essentially bonded to 2 other carbons, and the hydroxyl group comes off of that carbon, that would imply, therefore, the central one is a secondary alcohol. And likewise, we could even imagine a tertiary alcohol, where the hydroxyl group comes off of a carbon which itself is bonded to 3 other carbons as part of a larger chain molecule. And depending upon how much other stuff is around that hydroxyl functional group, that's going to affect the availability of that functional group to essentially bump into other molecules, and that's going to affect the reactivity of that molecule. So it would seem logical to us then that we might imagine that the behavior of a molecule is dependent upon not just the presence of the functional group, but also the neighborhood of where the functional group is found. So that's an alcohol molecule, the first of our simple functional groups we will be dealing with. All right, so we've now had a look at a functional group that was the hydroxyl functional group present in alcohol molecules. Next, we're going to have a look at some more functional groups that we'll commonly find in organic molecules. The first one is a functional group which is essentially a halide group, halide referring to a halogen element there. And the class of molecules which contains these is referred to as halohydrocarbons. For a generic formula, if we have R, again, representing the rest of the molecule, we would just kind of give this the generic formula Rx, where X represents one of the halogen elements. So it could be RCl, RF, RI, RBr, is a generic formula there. Halohydrocarbons, as it turns out, are very important chemicals in our world. There is one that you've probably heard of before, which is called a chlorofluorocarbon, or a CFC. An example of a simple halohydrocarbon would be something like, let's say, CCl2F2, which is a compound that goes by the name of dichlorofluoromethane, otherwise known by its commercial name of Freon, which was traditionally used as a refrigerant. We can go ahead and draw its Lewis dot structure there. We've got a central carbon, carbon being the least electronegative element there. We've got 2 chlorines and 2 fluorines bonded to that central carbon in a tetrahedral arrangement. And again, naming this thing here, it is based around the name for a single carbon alkane, which is methane. And we would call this dichloro-difluoromethane in our systematic naming system there. So those are halohydrocarbons. Our next one we're going to have a look at here, actually the next 2 we can kind of look at together. These aldehydes and ketones are both related to one another in that they share the same functional group. The name of that functional group is the carbonyl functional group, which is essentially a carbon double bonded to an oxygen. The difference between these 2 is where that carbonyl group is found. For an aldehyde, it's found on the end carbon of a carbon chain. We call that a primary carbon. And for a ketone, it's found on a secondary carbon. That is a carbon bonded to 2 other carbons. So same functional group there. We can go ahead and draw their formulas. For the aldehyde, we would give that generic formula of R and then C double bonded to an O. And then for the ketone, it would be R, standing again for the rest of the molecule. And then the C double bond O, that carbonyl functional group. And then on the other side, we've got another part of the molecule, so we'll just go ahead and call that R prime on the other side right there. So that would be an example of a ketone. Aldehydes and ketones tend to be fairly smelly compounds. There's a couple of familiar examples you might have seen before. One example would be if we give you this molecule right here with 2 carbons and a carbonyl group on the end there. We can go ahead and saturate the rest of the carbons as best we possibly can there. And again, you'll notice that the carbon on the end contains the carbonyl group, making this an aldehyde rather than a ketone. So to name these things, we're going to take the name of the generic alkane and then change the ending to Al for an aldehyde. Or for ketone, we're going to take the alkane name and add the suffix ONE. So looking at the aldehyde I've drawn right here with the 2 carbons, the name of the alkane with 2 carbons would be ethane, which means that this aldehyde we've just drawn right there would be ethanol. Al, not ethanol. Please be careful to distinguish between those two. Ol represents an alcohol. Al represents an aldehyde. So this is ethanal. Ethanal is a common compound that occurs in nature. It's found in a lot of different places. Naturally occurs in coffee and ripe fruit. So that's ethanal. You might have heard of it by another name, which is acetaldehyde. That's a kind of common name for the substance. Let's go ahead now and take a look at the ketone here. Again, it has the carbonyl group. And for an example of a ketone, I'm going to go ahead and draw a 3-carbon ketone. So I've got 3 carbons right there, and I'm going to put my carbonyl group on the central carbon there. So a carbon double bonded to the oxygen. And I can go ahead and saturate the carbons around the outsides there with hydrogens. So now I have a 3-carbon ketone, which means I'm going to take to name this thing the name of a 3-carbon alkane, which is propane, and change the suffix to ONE, which means this thing here, the 3-carbon ketone, is propanone. You probably have actually heard of propanone by a different name. Its common name, as it turns out, is acetone. Acetone is the primary ingredient in nail polish remover. So, aldehydes and ketones there share the carbonyl functional group. The only difference between the two, again, being the position of that carbonyl group, whether it's on a carbon bonded to 2 other carbons or on an end carbon within the molecule. All right, a couple more functional groups to look at here. The next class of molecules we're going to look at here is called an ether, and not a particularly tricky one to remember here. An ether molecule contains an ether functional group. Ether functional groups are essentially an oxygen which takes the place along the chain of carbons. So as a generic formula, we're going to go ahead and give an ether a formula of R, and then the O in the middle there, and then R prime on the other side, again, where R represents the rest of the molecule carbon chain. An easy way to remember ether, since you know me and I love dinosaurs, I always like to remember that Ethersaurus says roar, which would again be ROR for the generic formula of that ether. So we can remember it that way. As an example of an ether that you might be familiar with or have at least heard of before, this ether right here, where I've got a 2-carbon chain followed by that ether group, the oxygen, followed by another 2-carbon chain. This particular ether here, I'm going to go ahead and saturate the rest of those carbons around the outside as I draw the Lewis dot structure. This particular ether here is an ether which we name diethyl ether. Naming those ethers, not something we're going to have you worry about too much for this year, but just for your own edification. We name the essentially R groups on either side of the ether. So this is diethyl ether. If I had a methyl group on one side and the ethyl group on the other side, I would call that one ethyl methyl ether. 2 methyl groups, I would again call it dimethyl ether, and so on. And that diethyl ether, as it turns out, historically has been kind of an interesting compound. It was used as anesthesia for a long time, back when we first were doing surgeries a long time ago in the olden days. There's obviously much better compounds that we use for anesthesia these days. We don't really use it much anymore, but you still might see it like in old-timey novels and stuff like that. So that's an ether functional group. The next one we're going to deal with, next class of molecules, this is an important one, and this one will actually show up a lot on AP Chemistry, is what we refer to as a carboxylic acid. That contains the carboxyl functional group. And the carboxyl functional group is a little bit more complicated looking. It is a carbon double bonded to an oxygen and also bonded to another oxygen, which that oxygen is itself bonded to a hydrogen. And so I'm going to go ahead and just give it a generic formula there, which would be R for the rest of the molecule, and then C double bonded to O, and then bonded to O and H. And as it turns out, this carboxylic acid is a familiar acid to you all here. We've actually used it a number of times during last year's chemistry class. In particular, the most familiar carboxylic acid is an acid we refer to by its common name of acetic acid. Acetic acid, again, being a name for vinegar. So acetic acid is a 2-carbon molecule there, so we'll go ahead and throw 2 carbons right there. And off of one of the carbons, we're going to go ahead and put our carboxyl functional group. So we're going to put the double bonded oxygen and then the OH off of the side there as well, and saturate that other carbon with hydrogens around the outside. So this is an example of CH3CO2H, otherwise known as acetic acid. And again, acetic acid is a common name, not the official naming system we're going to be using. For the official naming system of a carboxylic acid, we're going to take the name of the alkane from which the acid is derived and add the suffix oic acid. So with a 2-carbon chain there, that would be based around ethane, the 2-carbon alkane, and I would therefore change the suffix of ethane to ethanoic acid for our naming of that particular species. Have a look here, guys, and this is an important one. One of the things I want you to be able to do as we get into organic chemistry here is to be able to predict some of the properties of these molecules based upon their molecular structure. And a carboxylic acid is kind of a good place to start with that process. So looking at ethanoic acid, it's got acid right there in the name, and from last year's chemistry class, you might recall that acids are proton donors. That is, they give up hydrogens to other species. So not surprisingly here, if I look at the structure of my ethanoic acid, I'll see here that I've got that hydrogen, which is kind of dangling off the end there off of the oxygen. And as it turns out, that is the acidic hydrogen in this molecule. The other hydrogens which are bonded to the carbon are not likely to be lost, and we can think about why based upon the structure. A carbon-hydrogen bond is more or less a nonpolar bond. And if you think about that oxygen to hydrogen bond, that's a highly polar bond, made even more polar by the presence of the other oxygen present in that molecule. Remember, oxygen is one of the most electronegative elements there is, the second most electronegative element on the entire periodic table, which means those oxygens are going to be pulling electron density towards themselves within that molecule. That is going to leave my hydrogen quite partially positive, and it's also going to decrease the electron density within that oxygen-hydrogen bond, having that other oxygen present there. And as such, I'm going to have a relatively weak bond, easy to break, and a very positive hydrogen, which is going to be attractive to other things, which means that hydrogen looks very much like a likely leaving candidate to act as an acidic hydrogen. As opposed to those carbon-hydrogen bonds there, which are relatively nonpolar, and therefore we don't have an attractive hydrogen to be picked off by other molecules. So, again, in what you're likely to expect to see in AP Chemistry is not naming in and of itself. I do want you to be able to name these things just for being able to talk about what we're discussing here. But really what you're likely to see is a discussion of molecular properties, and that's where we're really going with this conversation here. All right, we've got one more class of molecule here that is referred to as an ester. And these ester molecules are kind of like a derivative of a carboxylic acid. In fact, most esters are actually derived from reactions involving carboxylic acids. So whereas a carboxyl functional group was that carbon double bonded to the oxygen, bonded to another oxygen to a hydrogen, within an ester, essentially we're going to replace that hydrogen at the end with another alkyl group. So essentially another chain of carbons there. So for a generic formula of that ester, we're going to go ahead and give it R for the rest of the molecule, and then carbon double bonded to oxygen, bonded to a single bonded oxygen there, and then bonded to, let's call that R prime for another alkyl group over there. You can imagine how we actually might think about making an ester by reacting together an acid, like let's go ahead and look back to our carboxylic acid we used on our previous example there. That was ethanoic acid. So take a look at this ethanoic acid molecule, and then imagine ethanoic acid coming into contact with something like, let's say, methanol. Methanol is an alcohol derived from methane, one carbon therefore, and we've got the hydroxyl functional group present in an alcohol in methane. And you'll see here, if I bring methanol close to ethanoic acid, there seems like some good chemistry that could take place right there, recognizing that I've got that hydrogen, which is a good leaving group here, a good place to kind of move a hydrogen off, as we had an acidic hydrogen there. And I also have something that historically I've seen tends to attract hydrogens, which is an OH group right there. So putting together that H plus the OH, those can leave together as a water molecule. And as that water molecule leaves, we would reform a new bond between the roots of the other molecules, forming here an ester. So the process we just observed right there is actually how a lot of esters get formed or synthesized in organic chemistry. This is a reaction we refer to as an esterification reaction. And those esters are important compounds in the natural world. As it turns out, the process of forming esters helps us to form the backbone of DNA molecules. Besides in DNA, glycerides, fatty acid esters, are another place in biology we see esters occurring. There's also some other types of esters. If you have a nitrate ester, you might think of something like, say, nitroglycerin, which is a nitrate ester, which is an explosive. So pretty interesting molecules and interesting chemistry that goes into forming them. Naming these esters here, I'm not going to worry too much about naming esters because as it turns out, it's a fairly complicated process to name these esters. So for the time being, I'm just going to have you recognize that the suffix we add to name an ester is OATE, so that you can recognize an ester when you see that name, but I'm not going to ask you to name any of these on your own here. So 3 more functional groups there: ethers, carboxylic acids, and esters. All right, and for our last functional group we're going to look at here, we've got a class of molecules called an amine, which contains the amine functional group. That amine functional group is essentially a nitrogen atom with a lone pair of electrons. As it turns out, you've actually seen from back last year some amine compounds, in particular a very familiar one called ammonia, chemical formula NH3. And because we've got that lone pair of electrons hanging around there, trying to make some connections between the structure of the molecule and their behavior, that lone pair of electrons means that these amines can act as a Lewis base species, that is, a donor of an electron pair to form a bond. So, not surprisingly, ammonia and derivatives of ammonia generally act as bases. So, for a generic formula for an amine, we're going to start with that nitrogen with its lone pair of electrons, and I'm now going to go ahead and throw 3 R groups around the outside. Those R groups can either be alkyl groups, carbon chains, or they could just be hydrogens as well. So all of those would be considered amines. And again, naming these amines a little bit more complicated, but again, I want you to be able to recognize a name of an amine when you come across one. I'm not going to ask you to name amines yourselves. Amines are generally going to either get a prefix amino before the name of the rest of the molecule, or a suffix amine when we're naming those amine compounds. So, lots and lots of different functional groups to watch out for. Again, you're not going to have to probably do any actual official naming on the AP Chemistry test, but they will very much expect you to be able to look at the structure of these molecules, and from those structures, think about why they behave the way they do. That's the big goal of this process. All right, so now we've been introduced to a whole lot of functional groups. Let's go ahead and start naming some stuff. Much like all organic chemistry, you get better at it by just doing it here. So let's go ahead and dive right in. For example, number 1, I'm going to ask you to take these structures which are drawn right there and give names to these species. So have a look for me at the species on the left, and as with all of the organic chemistry naming we did last time, I want you to start by identifying the carbon chain we have there. I note 1, 2, 3 carbons right there, which means that this is based around the alkane molecule propane, and you see I've got a halogen hanging out on the second carbon right there. In particular, I've got chlorine. So starting with the name propane, I need to name the position on which my functional group lies there. So I'm going to go ahead and notate that as the second carbon in, regardless of which side I'm starting from. So this is carbon 1, 2, 3. So I'm going to go ahead and call this thing 2-chloro and then we'll name the alkane, which in this case would be propane. So this is 2-chloropropane. Easy peasy to start. Let's have a look now at the second one over here. For the second one on the right-hand side, I've got now a 4-carbon chain. And with that 4-carbon chain, I again need to start by numbering those carbons. I'm going to start numbering the carbon number 1 with the one that has the hydroxyl functional group coming off of it right there. As that hydroxyl functional group is on carbon 1, I always want to put my functional groups on the lowest number possible carbon. So I'm going to label these 1, 2, 3, 4, starting from the right-hand side there from our carbons. And I'm going to go ahead and start by notating here that I've got another chloro group on carbon number 3 in this chain. And the base name of this chain here is going to have to be based around the alkane name of a 4-carbon alkane, which again is butane. So let's start by naming this thing. This is going to be 3-chloro. And now I need to notate where that hydroxyl functional group here is as well. So I'm going to go ahead and put a 1 in here to notate the position of the hydroxyl group on carbon 1. And then I'm going to start with the stem of the name for butane, so but, and then I'm going to change the name from ane to anol, OL. So this is therefore 3-chloro, 1-butanol. And that OL ending again is the suffix we apply when naming an alcohol. So you can see kind of the process we go through there for those names to those species. Let's now go ahead and do this the other way around. In example 2, I'm going to give you the name and ask you to draw the structure. And this is going to require you to do some detective work, looking at those names for little clues, just like when we taught you nomenclature last year. So the first example there, we've got 3-methylpentanol. Let's see here. Let's kind of break this down. The root of this molecule is going to be that pentane molecule. So pentane is a 5-carbon chain, so I can go and throw 5 carbons in a row right there for my Lewis dot structure. And let's kind of break down the rest of it here. I've got 3-methyl. This is familiar from our last lecture here. A methyl group is an alkyl substituent group. I'm going to go and throw that onto carbon 3, a 1-carbon chain for a methyl group. And then the suffix of this particular name here is Al, and Al is the name that we give to a species which is a primary carbonyl group. That functional group is the primary carbonyl group, which we find in aldehydes. So I need to go ahead and throw a carbonyl group now onto my first carbon. And again, I'm going to put it onto that first carbon because I know when dealing with an aldehyde that aldehyde has to come on the end carbon. So I'm going to, by definition, then put the aldehyde functional group there, the carbonyl functional group on carbon number 1 within that aldehyde species there. So I'm going to put my double bonded oxygen right there, and now I just need to saturate as best possible the rest of my carbons with hydrogens. Got a bunch of hydrogens to draw in there, and at that point, I've got a complete structure for 3-methylpentanol. All right, that was a tricky one. Let's go ahead and have a look at our next one right here. A little bit more complicated looking name, a little bit more complicated drawing to do. I've now got 2,2-dibromo-3-pentanone. And this is getting messy here, so let's kind of break it down again. The root name for my molecule is again derived from pentane, the same 5-carbon chain. So we'll throw those 5 carbons in there, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And now that I've labeled the numbering system for my carbons here, on looks like carbon number 2, we got a lot going on there. On carbon number 2, I have 2 bromines coming off of there, so that bromo group. So that's 2,2-dibromo, so I've taken care of that portion of my name now. And now I've got to look now at, again, my suffix to this species, which is ONE. Remember from the discussion we just had about those functional groups, the suffix "-one" gets applied to ketones, which again contain that carbonyl functional group. And the carbonyl functional group now appears to be going on, notated here, carbon 3. So I'm going to go ahead and throw the carbon double bonded to an oxygen there on carbon number 3 for my carbonyl group. And I can now saturate the rest of my carbons with hydrogens. And it looks like I've now happily drawn here 2,2-dibromo-3-pentanone for our molecule. So you can see here, these names get kind of complicated, but again, as long as you are systematic about your approach to drawing and naming them, it really is not as scary as it might otherwise look. So we've given you an introduction to the somewhat terrifying looking world of naming organic molecules. We're going to kind of switch gears here a little bit and tackle a new subject here, which is an idea of isomers. We talked a little bit about isomers in last year's chemistry class. You might have heard that name from back in biology or even in earth science. And in terms of an isomer in organic chemistry, what we're really referring to here is two different chemical species that share the exact same chemical formula. And there's a bunch of different ways that can actually happen. So we're going to kind of break it down into a couple of different types of isomers. So the first one we're going to look at here is what we refer to as structural isomers. Those structural isomers share the exact same chemical formula as one another, but the atoms and bonds are arranged differently within the molecular structure. So I think the easiest approach to kind of seeing how that might look is to look at example number 3 down below here and just kind of work through it and recognize how that works. For example number 3, we're going to ask you here to draw structural formulas and to give the molecular formulas of these two molecules here, which are number 1, pentane, and number 2, 2,2-dimethyl-propane. So, pentane, easy peasy. After the nomenclature we've just done, this should look very friendly. Pentane is an alkane. Pent is a prefix which means 5, therefore I've got a 5-carbon chain, and the ane suffix there tells me I've got saturated hydrocarbon here, so I'm going to throw a whole bunch of hydrogens around the outside to form as many bonds as possible there. So that was an easy place to start. Let's now go ahead and draw 2,2-dimethyl-propane. Propane refers to a 3-carbon alkane. So let's go ahead and throw 3 carbons on there in a row. And now we'll see here, we've got a lot going on in carbon number 2, the central carbon of that chain. It looks like I've got 2 methyl groups present, both of them on carbon number 2. So I'm going to go ahead and throw 2 1-carbon side chains there, and then saturate the rest of this molecule as best possible. And this is getting kind of messy here with all those branches there, but you'll recognize here that the actual formula of both pentane and 2,2-dimethyl-propane is the exact same thing. That is, pentane is C5H12, following that 2n plus 2 rule for hydrocarbons. And 2,2-dimethyl-propane, as it turns out, also has 5 carbons and 12 hydrogens as well. So it's also C5H12. But because those molecules are arranged quite differently, they have quite different physical and chemical properties. In particular, the very linear nature of ethane, as opposed to the more kind of stuck together in one kind of blobby nature of 2,2-dimethylpropane, is probably going to change the essentially intermolecular forces present between these molecules. I might make that guess because if I have a longer chain molecule, it might seem that the London dispersion forces might be stronger in that particular molecule, because with a longer chain, you might end up forming more powerful spontaneous dipoles, as you can get essentially charges built up further away from one another along that molecular chain. So again, the exact same chemical formula, but completely different arrangement of their bonds makes those two species structural isomers of one another. All right, so on our previous slide, we had a look at structural isomers, which have the same chemical formula, but a different arrangement of the atoms and bonds within the molecule. We're going to look at a particular type of isomer on this next slide, which is referred to as a geometric isomer, sometimes called a stereoisomer. These particular species share the exact same chemical formulas and the same bonding order, but they differ only in their spatial arrangement. In particular, they differ in the arrangement of the atoms around a double bond. The presence of a double bond restricts the rotational motion of the molecule, and because of that, the molecule is not free to rotate as it would have been in a single bond. This essentially locks the position of the molecule in place. And depending upon the orientation of the functional groups or R groups, that is the alkyl substituents within the molecule, across that double bond, we see what we either refer to as a trans stereoisomer or a cis stereoisomer. So have a look at the two diagrams right here of butene. Note that both of these are examples of 2-butene, where the double bond comes after the second and before the third carbon in the carbon chain. But looking at the isomer on the left there, you'll see that the position of the remainder of the carbon backbone of that molecule within this molecule lies across the double bond, whereas on the molecule on the right side there, the position of the R groups or the alkyl groups there on either side of the double bond both lie on the same side of the double bond. So in the occurrence that we have those R groups across the double bond, we refer to that as trans 2-butene, as opposed to if we have the alkyl groups on the same side of that double bond, we refer to that as cis 2-butene. And again, by changing the relative position of those particles to one another, we're essentially going to change the behaviors of these molecules. These stereoisomers are often similar in terms of their properties to one another, but especially when you get larger chunks of those alkyl substituent groups or big functional groups on either side of the double bond there, the relative position of those alkyl groups, or kind of you can think about it as the crowding of those groups, might change the potential energy of the molecule. Now, I haven't seen any specific AP chemistry questions that require you to be able to name cis versus trans isomers of any particular organic molecule. But that being said, I would like you to be able to recognize them because they'll show up from time to time in your book and also as you go forward in your science careers. Sometimes, especially within biological molecules, we can see significant differences in terms of a preference of a particular biological pathway to the cis isomer versus the trans isomer. So one to be able to recognize, but not necessarily one that I'm going to be too worried about in terms of the AP test itself. All right, another type of isomer that we see here is what we refer to as a positional isomer. A positional isomer shares the same functional group and formula, but the position of that functional group is different between the two different isomers. So have a look here at these two particular isomers of propane here. Again, we've got a 3-carbon chain in both of those, and we also have a chloro group in each of those propanes in our diagrams there. But you'll notice that the chloro group is on carbon 1 in the isomer on the left and carbon 2 on the isomer on the right. So again, these might look like they're going to be very, very similar to one another chemically speaking, but again, we can kind of think that these might differ in their reactivities, especially if you have some crowding around that functional group. The functional groups oftentimes are places where we have particularly reactive sites on these molecules, and in order to react two molecules together, you have to get their reactive sites close enough to one another that the reaction can actually take place. So if you've got, let's say, like that 2-chloropropane right there, that central position of the chlorine might be less accessible to another molecule in terms of a chemical attack, which might change the reactivity of that particular species. So in all respects, those positional isomers are exactly similar to one another, except for the position of the functional group. Now, that is in contrast to the last type of isomer here we have, which is referred to as a functional isomer. A functional isomer shares the exact same chemical formula, but has different functional groups present. And I want to make sure we make a distinction between those positional isomers and those functional isomers that we're going to see on our next page right now. So again, positional isomer, same functional group, different position. Functional isomer, same chemical formula, but entirely different functional group present. Let's take a look at our next slide at what those look like. All right, and here we come to our functional isomers. And as it turns out, a discussion of these functional isomers is most directly relevant to problems we have seen on recent AP chemistry tests. In particular, it's been popular lately for them to look at the differences between the Lewis dot structures of these functional isomers and then ask you to be able to distinguish between some either chemical or physical properties of the molecules based upon those Lewis dot structures. So have a look here at example number 4 for me here. And at first glance here, it seems like these are two very different structures. In that on the left-hand side there, you might recognize at this point, having had our previous nomenclature discussion, that particular species is an ether. In particular, that is dimethyl ether. Again, ROR for Ethersaurus says roar. And again, the R groups on either side of the oxygen, the ether group there, are both methyl groups. So again, that would be dimethyl ether, as opposed to on the right-hand side there, we got a 2-carbon chain, which means this is a derivative of ethane, and a hydroxyl functional group, which means this thing is an alcohol. So this thing is ethyl alcohol, otherwise known by its name, ethanol. So looking at both of those two species, very different in terms of their structure, but also completely similar in terms of their molecular formula. Both of them have 2 carbons, both of them have 6 hydrogens, and both of them have 1 oxygen. So as a condensed molecular formula, both of these would be C2H6O. But the presence of those two different functional groups is very, very different. So in example 4 right there, it tells me to name and give the molecular formula for each of the following species, which we just did there. And then it asks us here, which of these two would be expected to have a higher boiling point? So between our dimethyl ether and our ethanol, first thing we need to think about in terms of boiling point is the intermolecular forces. As we discussed back in previous units here, the boiling point of a substance is determined by the relative strength of the attraction between those molecules. So let's think about which type of intermolecular forces are present in both of these species. On the left-hand side there, for our dimethyl ether, we have what is most definitely a polar species. Now, it looks very symmetrical right now, but remember, this molecule in three-dimensional space has a very different shape. Each of the carbon atoms there is got tetrahedrally arranged atoms around it, but in particular, the oxygen I want to pay attention to here, that oxygen in the center is actually bent geometry, with the two electron pairs on one side of the molecule and then those two bonds to the carbons on the other. And because oxygen is significantly more electronegative than those carbons, I would expect to see a net dipole pointing towards the oxygen in the center of that molecule right there. So that's going to tell me here I'm definitely going to have dipole-dipole interactions between these molecules of dimethyl ether. In addition to those dipole-dipole interactions, as with any species, we're going to have London dispersion forces as well. Now let's compare that on the other side there to our ethanol. The ethanol is also polar, which would imply, again, we'll have dipole-dipole interactions taking place there. It also will have London dispersion forces. But something I want to note here is a difference here in the ethanol, and that is I've got a hydrogen attached to that oxygen, and that hydrogen attached to the oxygen is going to be very, very partially positive due to the high electronegativity of the oxygen, which it's bonded to. So if I bring two ethanol molecules close to one another, we're in this situation here where I can form a hydrogen bond. And we'll go ahead and diagram that hydrogen bond between two adjacent molecules in a quick Lewis dot structure for you here. So, on the left-hand side, dimethyl ether has probably, in this case now, weaker intermolecular forces given that the ethanol can form those hydrogen bonds. And I would therefore make the prediction that my ethanol will probably be a species with a higher boiling point. That is, it will require more energy to separate apart those molecules due to the strength of the hydrogen bonding which can occur. So that's the sort of question that we've been seeing recently on the AP Chemistry test, asking you to, number one, do a little bit of knowledge about the actual structure of these molecules. They might even ask you to create Lewis dot structures, and then from those Lewis dot structures, take it a step further and make a relationship between the structure of the molecule and the observed behavior of that molecule. And as it turns out, our prediction is quite certainly true. There's a significant difference in the boiling points of those two different species. The ether is a highly volatile substance. Those ethers tend to evaporate very, very readily. That also makes them fairly dangerous substances. Ethers are used traditionally as organic solvents in the chemistry lab, and due to their highly volatile nature, they tend to form a lot of vapors, and those vapors themselves are flammable. So fairly regularly, we see in chemistry labs explosions due to presence of ethers in the laboratory. So yeah, there we go. We predicted, and it seems like it's borne out by some of our observed behaviors of those molecules. So those functional isomers are the ones I think we'll probably want to pay most attention to, but I also want you to be able to recognize those other isomers, in particular the structural isomers. We've also seen some recent questions related to those. All right, that does it for our second lecture on organic chemistry. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you on the next one.